for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar featuring insights for reopening restaurants with confidence. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, you may submit questions online using the Q&A feature located on the right side of your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to our website within about 48 hours. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Ketting, Vice President of Ipsos's U.S. Channel Performance Team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. And thank you all for joining us for our session on reopening restaurants with confidence and ensuring protections are in place to keep consumers safe, healthy, and loyal in what we call the 6-foot economy now. Let me start by recognizing that some of you may have attended our Reopen with Confidence webinar on May 15th, where our Nick Mercurio introduced you to the reasoning and processes behind our Ipsos Consumer Health and Safety Index. With results now in from that index from our first cross-industry, cross-brand mystery shop waves, this webinar is a continuation of that earlier webinar. For the majority of you who did not attend that first webinar, I will again set the stage by highlighting what we know about consumer health and safety perceptions today, and then Matt Connect will then highlight results from the first wave of our benchmarking index, and I'll follow with how you can get more details for your brand to leverage in measuring and managing site-level health and safety implementation. So let me get started. As the economy continues to reopen, we know brands must take steps to ensure consumers feel safe while shopping at their locations. Not doing so will risk customer defection, closed locations, and permanent damage to reputation and financial viability. As we spoke to clients, we quickly learned that many are struggling to understand which health and safety policies will have the greatest impact on consumer trust and confidence. Even more challenging for them was how to consistently measure and confirm that frontline managers were executing the new procedures that they were putting into place as we enter this new environment. Fortunately, the research we present today points to a clear path for solving these problems by answering these questions. First, what are consumers' new and evolving attitude towards health and safety? To do this, I'll share some findings from Ipsos's research about the pandemic and health and safety attitudes and perceptions in general. Much of this we're all aware of as we continue as consumers ourselves through this environment. Secondly, what makes consumers feel safe while shopping or eating at your locations? We'll share important factors that can help you prioritize the actions you can take that will make the most business impact. Last, we'll talk about what your brand can do to proactively measure and manage health and safety. And from a high level, and I know this is important and this is what you want to hear, what the food and beverage industry has been doing based on our first wave, our first mystery shop of brands in this food and beverage consumer health and safety index. Again, we'll do this via a quick intro to our consumer health and safety index, which is a cross-industry benchmarking study that leverages both consumer research and mystery shopping to help you understand what you need to do to make consumers feel most safe and then make sure your folks are doing it at the front line. Let's start with an important question. As we're seeing states and the economy as a whole reopen, when will we all be back to business as usual? And of course, the answer is, as we know now, it's not going to be for a very long time, if ever. A majority of Americans are staying home more and don't expect to return to the routine anytime soon. As summarized here, the majority of consumers expect pandemic conditions to last. They're going to be nervous to leave their homes even as businesses reopen. And consumers are unlikely to quickly return to public spaces or shopping, even when those conditions are lifted. So in the next few slides, I just want to make sure I point out that the findings that you're going to see come from nationally representative polling that we conduct weekly at Ipsos. Of course, in the midst of the crisis, Americans are picking up many new habits. We're learning new hobbies. We're cooking from scratch more often, and some of us are even eating healthier. People are stockpiling, but it should come as no surprise that the things we are doing most, the thing we are really doing most is staying home. But for necessities, food and work, the majority of us are truly venturing out. Sorry about the slides there. But even when businesses are allowed to fully reopen and travel resumes, 2 in 3 Americans will be hesitant to leave their homes. The same is true when you ask consumers a slightly different question, this time oriented towards their shopping behaviors. 66% of American consumers will delay returning to brick and mortar retail for at least 1 week once restrictions are fully lifted, and some much longer. In fact, 30% said it will take at least 3 months before they feel comfortable returning to brick and mortar retail. What's more, 61% say that getting sick is the main reason they will avoid in-person shopping. That is scary for consumers, for employees, and for our businesses. Now, the question is, how long will this persist? We are in an unprecedented situation now, but we can try to learn from other crises. And looking back to the 2008 Great Recession, we know these types of anxieties can persist long after the peak of the crisis. The data you see here is from our affluent survey, which we really run for decades here at Ipsos. In short, it shows how many Americans were very concerned with the economy during and post-recession. 75% were very concerned a year after it started, 70% 2 years, and still 65% 3 years after the start of the crisis. So what does this mean for brands? Given the severity of the current situation, we are likely now living in the new normal. Ultimately, safe business will be good business, particularly when you consider leading health experts warning that reopening the country too early and without the proper precautions could result in a second wave of the virus. As I'm sure we all agree, not only do businesses have an obligation to society, their consumers, and their employees, that is, to take health and safety seriously as they reopen, but they also have an obligation to their shareholders and the bottom line. How costly will it be for brands to reopen, only to have to close back down for not doing things right, or as the virus flares up again? What will the damage be to their reputation, the consumer loyalty and profits? The data says it will be a lot, and consumers will remember those that do it right and those that do not. Again, this means safe business will be good business for some time. So how do Americans feel about health and safety? Let's transition into talking about some of the data we have. Excuse me. The information I'm about to share comes directly from our Consumer Health and Safety Index, measuring the attitudes and perceptions that consumers have around health and safety. The objectives were twofold. First, to identify the key drivers of likelihood to return to stores that shoppers consider to be critical. Second, to identify key insights about future consumer behavior once restrictions are lifted. We polled about 2,000 Americans with a nationally representative sample of the U.S. population. Keep in mind this data is recent. The first portion of the study occurred about 14 days ago, which was followed by the mystery of shop at the brands, the second phase, just last week. And we'll share that information with you as we move along here. Here's a summary of the key findings of the consumer portion of that study. Trust is low with most retailers right now, but particularly those who already suffered, reputationally. Interestingly, customers feel they are exerting more effort than companies to keep themselves safe. Last, there's not only opportunity to grow share of market and wallet, but brands that really excel with getting health and safety right have an opportunity to charge a premium. As you might expect, consumers continue to shop most at those retailers deemed essential. 90% have been out to a grocery store, and many are still frequenting gas stations and convenience stores. And fast food restaurants remain relatively high on the list at 50%, as you can see here, while more discretionary offerings like quick-serve restaurants or coffee shops have seen significant drop-off. One thing I felt to keep in mind is that, as you know, the lines are blurred when it comes to eating out. The convenience store industry, and grocery as well, have been making the effort to grab some of the market share. As the screen grab shows, that industry is highly focused on regaining and growing the consumer base. And of course, during these trips, consumers are observing health and safety protocols. They're making judgments about which organizations are putting effort into health and safety and earning, or as you could say, eroding their trust. As we show here, grocery stores are trusted more than any other industry, followed by banks, big box, and club retailers. A little concerning is that 25% of American consumers don't trust any industry for their health and safety practice. We're clearly showing that there's opportunity to improve here across industries. Furthermore, there is a strong relationship between trust for an industry and the perception that the employees take health and safety seriously. Again, we see that seeing employees display health and safety attitudes, behaviors, and actions, it's critical. And how they are equipped by their employers, is extremely important to consumers. So how important is health and safety to American consumers right now? Obviously very important, as you can see from the numbers below. Take the chart on the left. The specific question we asked here is, when selecting a retailer to shop at, how important are the health and safety measures they are taking to keep customers and employees safe? 55% of those we polled gave a top 2 box rating. We then asked them about the effort they put into keeping themselves safe and the perceived effort companies are exerting as well. The takeaway, customers feel that they are exerting more effort than companies, which is usually a bad recipe and certainly explains the low trust scores we just showed earlier. As you'd expect, health and safety protocols are the most important factor when deciding to return to shopping. 4 times more important than good customer service. Suffice it to say, health and safety has become the most important element of the retail customer experience. The implications for companies not exerting enough effort in this area can be very damaging to their brands. 62% of Americans will stop shopping at retailers who are not taking health and safety seriously. That leaves little margin for error, of course. But for brands that get it right, they not only will grow share of market, they'll grow share of wallet, and they are earning the right to charge a premium for their products and services. A quarter of Americans are willing to pay at least 10%. Some 5% of which is approximately 16 million of Americans are willing to pay as much as 25%. This presents a huge opportunity for some brands. So now that we've completed the waves, wave 1, the mystery shop of the index, and that is of target brands, let's talk about what we found, particularly in your industry, in the food and beverage industry. Matt?
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Kanak. I am a senior client officer and a senior vice president at Ipsos. And I'm going to walk you through some of the findings from each of our 2 studies that you're hearing about today. One, as Chris has teed up, the preliminary remarks I'll have in the first section are tied into the consumer study that Chris has been talking about. And then we'll pivot, and fresh out of field last week, I also have some information that I'm excited to share with you focused on the mystery shop evaluation of compliance at the site level that we did across categories and brands. So Let's dive in a little bit more. I'd like to talk some more with you about what we found as we did some of the additional testing in the consumer study. I'm having some technical difficulties with my slides not advancing. There we go.
How about I just go ahead and do that for you, Matt? You just tell me.
I got it. I think we're caught up now, Chris. I wanted to start by sharing. I realize it's a little small on the page, but when we went out to decide, or to try to help understand what was going on in the market, we measured consumer perceptions across more than 20 health and safety attributes. You can see the 23 of these that are articulated here, and that gave us an awful lot of opportunity to determine across different categories and different types of businesses what were the component parts that were resonating, because we had a lot of hypotheses to test in this exploratory work. We wanted to try to figure out, were the messages clear in and across categories, or did they vary? As we look at different types of businesses, did different dimensions of health and safety rise to the top, or were they consistent? And so when we crafted the initial efforts in data collection, we threw a wider net rather than a more narrow net so we could be as comprehensive as possible. And so these are the 23 that we came up with. Oh, Chris, my computer's not working, so I am going to give control back to you, and we'll see if you can advance them better than me. My apologies, everyone, for the technology. We ran 5 different driver analyses based on a handful of different outcome variables. Certainly likelihood to return is extremely important. Net Promoter Score has had lots of traction over the years, so likelihood to recommend was another outcome variable we wanted to model. Chris has already touched on the wide disparity in trust, certainly with the leading category being grocery stores at only 33%, and the number 2 organization group being banks at 10%. There's very low levels of trust when it comes to health and safety. Perceptions of company effort and a willingness to pay a premium on the financial side were all dimensions that we wanted to understand as we explored the data that were available. And it was fascinating for us to find out, next slide please, Chris, that all 5 driver models came back very consistently. It was important for us to drill down as we looked across categories. I've mentioned a variety of categories were included. You can see here on the left-hand side that the core design to the program spans a variety of different business units: big box stores, home improvement, oil and gas, drugstores, grocery, telecommunications, and food and beverage groups. And as I get into the subsequent slides a little bit farther down, it's important that I share with everybody the 10 food and beverage brands that were included in the initial launch wave in the analysis. So the sneak peek that I'm going to give you in a few minutes covers these 10 brands. And I showed the 23 attribute statements above. We clustered those into measurement categories, and some of the aggregated data that I'm going to show in just a few minutes breaks down and looks at these categories of performance within each of the 10 restaurant brands. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit. It's a very substantial data set. In the other sectors and categories, we had between 5 and 20 brands that were captured for each of those. So you can see that at an individual brand level across all of those segments, we had a very wide range of assessment that was taking place. Next slide, Chris. So the driver modeling in aggregate came back kind of as you can see on the screen here. There are 16 of the 23 attributes that are shown. What we wanted to really drive home was it was fascinating when we did the analysis to realize that across all 5 of the outcome variables that I showed just a moment ago, the modeling was amazingly consistent. So no matter how you wanted to drive towards a more healthy business, when we take into consideration health and safety dimensions, the things that rise to the top are really consistent across all 5 different outcome variable models. And this really, I think, simplified and streamlined potential decision-making for you and your businesses as you consider what it is that you want to focus on. we can absolutely let you know, and I'll touch on it more in just a couple of slides. The highest impact variable in all of the models, the number one position was the same for everybody. And I think it also represents an opportunity. Next slide. We broke down this driver modeling into two areas. We felt like all of this cluster of kind of moderate impact elements that had kind of moderate to high performance were things that we needed to make sure that everybody understood. You're not really going to differentiate on these anymore in the rapid response that the restaurants have had to the pandemic. These are areas in which we've seen most of the organizations start to respond pretty well. We felt like these were table stakes, and in order to compete going forward and maintain whatever trust has been established so far, these are areas in which, as an organization, you need to continue to perform at least reasonably well. Next slide, Chris. I realize it's a little difficult to read on this page, so we wanted to call those out for you. And you might say, okay, well, this is great because we've got this part down. I mean, there are very few locations now across multiple businesses that you don't see employees wearing masks and gloves. There has certainly been a massive proliferation of hand sanitizers being available both at the entrance to the store and restrooms. Sanitizing wipes have been made available in a variety of different organizations at different places throughout the store. And social distancing markers, especially when we're controlling how many people can be in the store, those outdoor distancing markers are extremely important. Next slide, Chris. One of the things that really came clear as we started to think about and look at those, you can see in some of the pictures on the page, bottom left and top right, certainly you can see what most of us have actually started to become accustomed to, seeing masks and gloves on the people that are serving us. Interestingly, certainly in the middle picture, this idea that we have distancing markers outside so that people aren't close to one another, we see much more makeshift and impromptu efforts in order to serve the market. And if you look kind of top left and bottom right, there are sanitizer stations, either liquid sanitizers or wipes being made available. And you can clearly see, these were not parts that were built into the design of the restaurant. We're taking advantage of the space that we have available to us in order to clean up and offer up ways for customers to use sanitizer or wipes as they see best fit in the space that we have available to us. So it's a little bit of reacting to what's going on around us, and that's kind of a theme that continues to emerge. The market's looking for something new and not something that we were designed for originally. Next slide, Chris. While the table stakes are important, we wanted to call out what we felt like were the differentiators or the opportunities to create competitive advantage. And we chose that language carefully because, as you'll see in just a minute, there's still a tremendous amount of opportunity in the market for organizations that understand what the consumers are looking for to set themselves apart. This has been a rapidly changing and evolving situation, and we continue to see new baseline expectations established as the competitors continue to adapt and adjust. Just like on the previous slide, we'll call them out in just a minute, but here you can see much more high impact variables. And out of everything we tested, these top 5 were the ones that bubbled to the top each time. And we could even further split this into, you can kind of see the 3 on the right-hand side that have a little stronger performance, and then the blue and the green on the left where there's moderate to weaker performance, even though there's very high impact. So if you'll jump to the next slide, Chris, we see that, of these 5, employee safety equipment is provided by the employer, and organized management of occupancy were the 2 high impact variables that had moderate to low performance. Again, a clear 6-foot social distancing markers, plexiglass dividers at the counters, and employees visibly disinfecting the entrance trays or counters. All of these really bubble to the top. Now, that said, I think Chris touched on it a little bit earlier. This is an extremely visual experience for customers. Right now, their perceptions of trust and the degree to which you as a brand are taking care of them are largely driven by the things that they can see. I have a blue star by this employee safety equipment is provided by the employer, because in all 5 models, this was clearly the highest impact variable out of the 23 statements that we tested. Those of you that are social scientists or researchers realize that if you run 5 separate outcome variables across 23 attributes, having the same single attribute pop to the top in all 5 models is a pretty rare occurrence. So I think really speaks to the degree to which this one element seems to tie a lot of what customers are interested in into a single encapsulation, if you will. Next slide, Chris. Here you can see a variety of the different types of solutions that we've seen in the market. Certainly the wiping down of the entrance doors, the markers on the floor, and even the different ways that some organizations are choosing to call out how to occupy tables so that we maintain social distancing. Plexiglass at the counters has become extremely prevalent. It seems to have popped up in a variety of different categories, including restaurants, over a very short period of time. So just some illustrations visually, some of the different things that we've seen in the key top drivers. One more, Chris? We did look at some of the things that kind of jumped out and had a bit of a negative story to tell in the analysis. There were a few pitfalls. Most of these are common sense, but analytically it was supported in our data. Doing nothing at all is certainly not something that's an option, right? Clearly this is a really big deal to customers in virtually all categories, and so going out and assuming that you can just return to business at normal is a massive risk to your business. It shows that you're very tone deaf. Secondly, consistency is something that your customers will expect from you. What you get in one location from a brand should match up with what you're getting from another location from a brand, and not only across locations, but across purchaser experiences at a single location over time. Consistency will be extremely important, largely because inconsistency raises doubt and erodes trust, which by and large is already at a low level. So being a new organization with which they quickly feel you have their interests at heart and they get the same high level of treatment again and again is going to be extremely important going forward. And then finally, heaven forbid, we really don't want the customer to feel like you're making them do more than you're doing. We had a graphic in the original presentation that was non-restaurant based that was a little amusing to look at, where you saw a customer with gloves and a face mask on paying at a counter in which there was no plexiglass, and the employee at the counter did not have gloves or a mask on. And clearly that mismatch is something that you would strive to avoid pretty much at all costs. Let's switch now. I think we get to jump into what some of the information that we found from the mystery shopping that we conducted last week said. This is hot off the press. It has not been presented publicly until today. The first thing that we did is we created, as part of our assessment of compliance at the brand level, a health and safety index score. And the score does technically range from 0 to 100. So any of the researchers in the group that would like to have the context, realizing that we have a best-in-class score in the grocery category of 50.4, certainly that's not a very high score. That said, think back to the types of dimensions that were outlined in the consumer study. We threw a very wide net, and with the rapid change in the marketplace, it's extremely difficult for any category to be good at everything right now. And so we're not surprised by the relatively low scores. That said, we do think there's tremendous opportunity for improvement across all categories. I did outline the categories a moment ago. We pasted the average score in the middle at a 38.7. So as you can see, on a category basis, tech and telco and oil and gas are the only two categories that are trailing food and beverage, while grocery, big box, pharmacy, and home improvement all have a slight edge. Certainly that 36.9 to 37.0 is not a big switch, so we would certainly call home improvement a push. But that 13, 14-point difference between restaurants and grocery shows that on a category level, there's a pretty substantial shift in ability to deliver compliance at the grocery store level versus what the restaurants have been able to do thus far. If we drill in a little bit, that gives us the kind of macro context of where restaurants sit as a category. Let's take a look at the 10 brands that we tested, just to give you some idea of what that distribution looks like. A variety of things on this slide. I did want to go ahead and show everybody all 10 brands. So I wanted to show not only what the restaurant average looked like, but I wanted everybody to get to see what the total variation was. So to start, in the boxes at the top, we see a range of response in the Health and Safety Index score from a low of 32.9 to a high of 40.5. So just about an 8-point swing. That's a real difference. I mean, certainly some other brands are doing a better job on compliance at health and safety across the board than others. There's, I think, kind of a lead pack. You can see that 40.5, and then in the numbers that are underlined at the top, 39.7 and 39.6, you know, they're all within a point of one another. Those are kind of the best practice firms. And then there's kind of a little bit of a cascade effect that goes down from there in fairly straight increments. Notably, we did not see a big stratification where there were 2 or 3 that were leading and then everybody else was lagging substantially. And also notably, the weakest performing brand on the compliance index score was not dramatically behind everybody else. To me, this clustering becomes really important to realize that while somebody is a little bit better than somebody else, right now we don't have anybody that has completely taken advantage of the opportunity and set themselves apart. Lastly on this slide, I'll just call out, in a few minutes I'm going to offer a brief summary. Kind of keep an eye, if you can, on brands 1, 4, and 9, because I think that they all bring more macro insights and strategic implications to how each of these brands should be considering decision-making on a go-forward basis. Chris, next slide. So, out of question, right, one of the really big business issues that Chris called out at the very beginning of the presentation is how likely are customers to come back once they've experienced us. We looked at likelihood to return, and across the 10 brands, somewhat surprisingly, we found that there was 16.5-point spread between the brand that had the highest likelihood to return and the brand that had the lowest. We also, again, saw a pretty consistent cascading effect from the strongest to the weakest. Brand 1 on the far left, out in front, we saw a nice split in the average. There are 5 brands that were above average and 5 below. Brand 4 is kind of in the middle, if you will, kind of lagging the lead pack a little bit, but in the thick of things. And there were certainly a handful of brands that seemed to fall off a little bit more than the rest. So a little bit more stratification, but a pretty wide range of overall assessment on likelihood to return. If you think of it another way, if we call these percentage points, which one of you would be interested in giving up 1 in your 6 customers being willing to come back? I mean, that 16% can be a pretty substantial economic impact, especially in times where, as Chris showed so clearly at the beginning, people may be a little nervous to go back in the first place. So getting it right quickly is going to be extremely important, especially from a financial perspective. Next slide, Chris. I mentioned earlier that we sorted the attributes that we tested and the dimensions that we asked the mystery shoppers to evaluate the brands on into categories so that it was a little bit more manageable. Now, clearly still we have 9 categories that we're assessing. It's not as bad as trying to look across 23 attribute statements. But to me, this was the single largest dimension of the analysis so far that really just jumped off the page. We have 4 things that were extremely clear, that scored extremely well in the compliance assessment. Wearables, overall feeling of safety, likelihood to return, and perceptions of company effort. All very strong scores. Compared to everything else we've seen in the deck so far, to be able to get up in the mid-70s, really, really good numbers. However, you know, if you think back in your research careers, when did we have a range from essentially 15 to 80 on the same slide? I mean, that second tier barriers and effective use of distancing, very tepid, very moderate, 20 to 25 points lower than the lead pack. And yet, amazingly, still almost 25 points ahead of the laggard group. And we clearly see very weak performance in cleanliness signage and the consistent availability of sanitizer, both at the entrance in the restrooms and throughout the locations. And this stratification really screams that it's going to be important for firms to understand that we're not in a situation where we were a competitor in a mature market like we were 16 weeks ago, where the variables are known and all of us that are pretty strong competitors are pretty good at most of the things that matter. Maybe for the first time in many of our careers, we find ourselves facing a circumstance where our business is not performing very well at least some dimensions that we know that are extremely important to customers, especially in this transition time of reopening, bringing them back into the dining rooms for an on-site experience, and reestablishing a business space with an organization that has seen a lot of challenges in being able to engage in the past quarter. One more slide, Chris. I've got 2 left, and then I'll give it back to Chris, and then we can open up to questions that you can provide in the question box. This slide, a few moments ago, I asked you to kind of keep an eye on brands 1, 4, and 9. This is a heat map that shows strong to weak comparison in each of the 9 categories that I just outlined for you. And you can see that, it's easy to think brand 1 has kind of got the tiger by the tail, right? They've got a variety of things that they're good at, and really from a heat map perspective, there's only one that jumps out as being a particular weakness, maybe 2. Likewise, as you jump down to the brand that's listed as brand 9 here, they don't seem to be particularly good, competitively speaking, at any of the categories. And in point of fact, they're pretty bright red on 4 of the 9. So really lagging the pack in about half of what we're assessing as known dimensions of safety and health that are important to customers. Brand 4 is particularly intriguing to me because as a brand, they're really good at the things that brand 1 is not. So it's almost a yin and yang from a competitive standpoint. They're fairly moderate at the areas in which brand 1 is particularly strong. And just like brand 1, they have one area in which they're performing particularly poorly relative to competition barriers. Chris, if you click once more, I just wanted to remind everybody, based on our safety and compliance index scores, I can show you their ranking. So believe it or not, brand 4, as shown several slides ago, was the top performing brand on our health and safety index score. Brand 1, who appears in the heat map to be pretty much leading all scores, actually was only 3rd in the health and safety compliance. And not surprisingly, brand 9 in this list here ranked 10th of the 10 brands tested in their health and safety compliance index. I think that this kind of sets us up for a brief summary that outlines a handful of things. One more slide, Chris, and then I'll give it back to you. We can't stress or emphasize enough. People right now are very stressed. There's still a high degree of concern, and right now they have an overwhelming tendency to believe what they see. And as you would expect from especially developed markets, this is a very U.S.-centric study, consistency is extremely important. Being able to have the same experience time and again at a single location and being able to have a consistent experience across separate locations will be extremely important in establishing that trust and drawing customers back in as you reopen your doors. Second, much more than the building, right? The building is what it is. Right now we have a much lower focus on things like menu items, et cetera. Be clear in understanding that employees are your number 1 asset and the greatest opportunity for you to connect with people, make them feel at ease, and be actively demonstrating that health and safety is an important priority to your brand. And then those customers, as they leave, will not only be willing to return, but also we'll be able to advocate for you as others talk about places where they did not have very good experiences. And then the third point on this slide, I think, is extremely important. As much as I wish that this could be the new gold standard, that we could just apply the insights from this brief presentation to manage your decision making for the next 3 to 6 months, everything's changing very quickly now. And as you and competitors start to differentiate from one another, the lead pack will certainly start to set the pace in terms of what it is that everybody else needs to do in order to keep up. Once that happens, certainly consumers and customers will react, right? Once you get something right, they'll look for you to exceed in another area or excel or advance what it is that you're doing to take care of them in a new way. So there's certainly a high demand for innovation, but in a brand new way than many of us have been thinking about innovation until very recently. And so kind of with that, this idea that being able to pivot and adapt going forward, being extremely important to driving mid to long-term success. I'll give it back to Chris to wrap up. This kind of concludes the majority of the content part of the presentation. So if you have any questions that are tied to either any of the data that Chris presented or my section, please go ahead and punch them into the Q&A section right now. And Chris, I'll give it back to you to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Matt. As we've shared through this presentation, the first wave of our Consumer Health and Safety Index is completed. Results have been analyzed and reporting is ready for those brands that desire it. When I say first wave, I'm referring to the assessment, the mystery shop of those target brands you saw earlier to identify those brands or how they're doing in implementing health and safety protocols and how they're ensuring the consumer feels safe. So even if your brand is not represented in that target list we just completed, the results are of value to you because they'll allow you to understand what makes consumers feel safe in your stores. You'll be able to benchmark against key competitors and discover effective cross-industry strategies. And it'll help you to understand how to comply with regulations to keep stores open and consumers feeling safe. So if you're interested in that information, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me here at this number or this email address, and we'll be happy to talk about how we can share more of that detail with you. So I didn't want to spend too much time on that. I know we're at the end of our time here. I do want to try to get a question or two in. So let me read some of what I'm seeing here. And Matt, maybe this is a question for you. I'm seeing a question on the sneak peek results section on the category overview. That is really wide range of scores. Is that typical to have that much of a range, and why do you think that is? Matt?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly no, to have a range of performance levels like that is not typical. Historically, and especially in businesses where competition is fierce, most organizations don't survive if they have performance levels that are 60 to 65 points behind that of the lead competitors. We wouldn't expect to see a range that big. I think that the reason that we're seeing such a big range is most of what we're looking at in the Health and Safety Index is uncharted waters. People haven't been there before. Businesses are trying to come up with new ways of supporting their customers and engaging them that they haven't ever had to do before. And we're seeing very reviews of what firms are doing to react, as well as the consistency and breadth of ability to implement those changes. And what that's doing is creating new experiences, and these new experiences aren't very consistent, which I think is what's driving the particularly low scores on the lower end of the continuum.
Great, Matt. And again, we're getting close on time, so I'm just going to read one more question. And Matt, maybe I'll just serve this one to you as well. If you had to go one more step, what was the one thing that you considered including in this presentation but did not tell us, at least yet?
That's such a great question. I'll give you two. One of them is very tactical, and then one of them a little more strategic, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about it at some point in time. I think that first, given that employees are wearing masks and gloves provided by employers was the number one dimension in all of the modeling, I think there may be an opportunity to leverage your branding. You know, can you get masks or gloves that match your corporate colors? Can you put a small subtle logo in one of the corners or on the back of the gloves? It just seems like in our scramble to get everybody out there, having them is certainly more important than not having them. But from a natural evolution standpoint, the idea of doing a very small and subtle branding with some of your safety equipment really creates a potential to put a nice bow on it. That's totally based on conjecture. We haven't tested it. I don't have any attributes that I can point specifically to other than that one to say, Matt, why might you say that? But, you know, the context of the question is, what didn't we own that I might throw out there? That's the tactical one. The strategic one, I think, really explore the drivers and be willing to lean into whatever it is that appears to be the most important to consumers next. I think there are two things that come out of that. We do see relatively low scores across the board, and so there's a lot of varying demand. Picking a couple of things and really choosing to own them, especially visible dimensions, as things that your firm does better than anybody else, creates the pathway to competitive advantage. And it also starts to map what might be next. You know, if we're all about wearables now, then wiping down and visibly keeping tables well spaced is going to quickly follow. We saw relatively low scores across the board in the availability of sanitizers. So really taking some quick action to show that you've made sanitizer available throughout your restaurant might be a quick and easy hit that you might be able to take action on that will give you a chance to step up when your competition hasn't yet. But I think really picking a couple and leaning into will be really important.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. And please reach out if we can be of assistance as you look to reopen your restaurants in this new environment. Ellen?
Thank you. This now concludes today's webinar. You may now disconnect.